Hello, welcome to AP Comparative Government. Today I'm going to be talking about methods of political analysis. This is the first lecture in this series designed to cover all the basics of the course in pretty quick detail. If there is a PDF in the show notes if you would like to follow along to take notes. Otherwise, everything is pretty self-explanatory. All right, so in starting out, we have to think about what is a political scientist going to do? Well, just like any scientist, a political scientist is going to use data to form hypotheses and come to conclusions. All right. Now, there's really two different ways of looking at evidence in AP comparative government. We have what's called empirical data. Empirical data is designed and based on factual statements and statistics. I'll give you an example of that in a moment. So, again, empirical data, factual statements, and statistics. Normative data requires value judgments. So, that's the difference. Requires value judgments. So, here's an example. Empirical evidence would mean we're studying the relevant economic statistics for a country, like gross domestic product, GDP, its exports and imports. And if we're just doing an empirical analysis, that's all we're doing. We stop right there. Now, if you're doing normative political science, what you might do is you might look at the exact same figures, GDP, exports, and imports, but then we're going to make a value judgment based on them. So then we're going to argue whether or not those statistics are positive or negative for the country itself. So again, try to remember normative is associated with some sort of a value judgment, a deeper analysis, in other words. Next, we have to talk about what we're looking at. So typically, when we're talking about political science, we're talking about variables. What's a variable? A variable is a measurable trait and characteristic that changes under different conditions. So, depending upon the condition, it might change. I'll give you an example in just a minute. Now, there's two types of variables: independent variables and dependent variables. Independent variables are the influencer. They're the things that are making the change. A dependent variable is the influenced, the thing that is changed as a result. Here's a great example. We could look at two variables, income level and level of education. What we would quickly figure out is that educational level is the independent variable. Income level becomes the dependent variable. As your education goes up, so does your income level. As it goes down, so does your income level. So income level, that variable is dependent on the educational level, which is independent. Understanding those is very important. And that brings us to sort of one of the meat of today's topics, which is causation versus correlation. Sort of understanding this distinction is very, very important. Starting with correlation first. How do you define correlation between variables? Correlation is simply nothing more than a mutual relationship or a connection, whichever way you want to think about it, between two or more things. So there's some sort of connection, or there appears to be some sort of connection between two items, two variables. And again, I'll give you an example in just a moment. Causation is very different. Causation is when the action of causing something, so the relationship between cause and effect. So when you have two variables and you have causation, you have one that is affecting the other. Correlation is when there's just a connection. So let's take an example. Let's say we're looking at data and notice that both crime, the rate of crime, and ice cream sales peak in July and August. Those results are correlated. They are both related to the same months. They both peak at the same time. Okay, but how are they connected? Are they causally related? Does one of those two things influence the other? Now, to investigate causation, we might pose a question like this: does an increase in crime cause an increase in ice cream sales? Well, of course, we'd quickly figure out that there is no causality. High crime rates and ice cream sales simply share something in common. They're correlated. They happen more often in the summertime than other times of the year. All right. So that is a correlation, but it's not a causation. On the other hand, if we go back to our economic example, income level and educational level are causally related because one changes the other. All right. If ice cream sales go down randomly in July, that does not mean that crime is going to go down. There's no causal relationship between those two variables. This is an idea we'll come back to again and again. All right. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is something that's just kind of important for the class, which is to understand, when we're doing comparative analysis, we are comparing two different things. So, what are we comparing in this course? What are you expected to compare on the AP test? There's four main categories, I think. First is what I call traditional comparison. That would be things that we've always looked at. For example, you could compare an authoritarian state to a democratic state. Taking our examples that we have, we could compare Iran, which is more of an authoritarian state, and Great Britain, which is a democratic state. So you could compare those two things. That'd be a traditional analysis. Then there's informal politics. Informal politics looks at how the beliefs, values, and actions of ordinary citizens have an effect on policy making. For this end, we have to understand this idea of civil society. Well, how do we define civil society? Civil society is the way citizens organize and define their interests. Again, a topic we'll get much more into, just introducing it now. We might also do a comparison that looks at political change. Political change has been something that's come up a lot recently. Mainly here, what we're talking about is post 1991 and the fall of the Soviet Union. The impact of change is important in this case, mostly because after the fall of the two superpowers, so the USSR and then you have the United States, which obviously still exists, but the United States is not one of our countries that we study in this case. But what happens is you begin to see the pace of political change increases a lot after 1991, mostly because the Soviet Union falls away. And so studying that change, how things are different compared to during the communist rule, is also important. The last one is integration between political and economic models. This recognizes the connection between government, politics, and the economy. Citizens impact and are impacted by economic factors, which then often does and might fuel how those citizens perceive their government. Of course, it is possible to do political science without talking about economics, but the fact of the matter is today, most citizens of the world connect their government with the prevailing economic systems that are practiced in their nation state. And that's something, again, that we'll get back to later on. If you were looking at one of these in terms of which one I think is more on the upswing right now, it would be the last one. I think, especially as we start to talk about topics like the European Union later on and some other economic factors, I think it's crucial, especially when we look at data, to understand the interaction between politics and economics. All right, lastly today, I just want to talk and introduce our country groups. All right, so there are 6 countries that are studied in AP CoGo, aka AP Comparative Government. And you can break them down into roughly 4 categories, although there's some crossover here. There are what we call the advanced democracies. These are countries with well-established democracies that have been around for a long time. Of our 6 core countries, this is Great Britain. Then we have our communist, post-communist countries. These are countries that traditionally sought to limit individual freedom in order to divide wealth more equally. Here, we have to think about Russia and China. Then we have our newly industrializing countries. These are countries that are experiencing rapid economic growth with tendencies toward democratization. Mexico is our biggest example here. Iran also tends to go in this category, though with a lot of caveats. Finally, we have what we call less developed nations. Here, what we tend to recognize is a significant lack of economic development and a tendency towards authoritarianism. In this final case, what we're talking about is Nigeria. We'll get into specifics about all 6 of these countries later on, but those are the basic categories and principles to set the stage for what's next.